Thanks. Good evening, everyone, and you are very welcome to tonight's Thinking. My name's Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise. Great pleasure to have your company as ever. I think most of you know now what a thinking is. We talk about it as the engine of our journalism, the way that we help ourselves through talking to you, understand subjects better, get a better informed point of view about things that are happening in the world, or in this case, looking back rather at things that happened some time ago. We have one rule that we enforce in a sort of variable way, which is that we don't want questions. We want to hear what you think. We want to hear what your points of view. And surely on New Labour, you've got a point of view. I mean, you know, the whole political project has been argued about endlessly for the last several years. So we do hope that you will join in, whether you're here in the room or on the Zoom end of this. Either way, we want to hear what you think. We want to hear what you thought at the time, what your thoughts are as time has passed. I'll just start very quickly with a story because I remember it so vividly. In 2015, I was still at the BBC, and the Labour leadership campaign started. And I remember, and you know, we probably all remember that moment when it became clear that things were not going quite as expected, that there was sort of real, to coin a phrase, momentum behind Jeremy Corbyn. So I jumped on a train and went out to Chelmsford to go to a Jeremy Corbyn rally, and it was a very Labour event. Everybody had to speak, and the person everybody wanted had to go last. That's the Labour way. So we had the local NUS, we had the fire brigade, we had the regional TUC, we had a whole bunch of people. And at the end of it all came Jeremy Corbyn. And I remember making a note to myself at the time, my little notepad, saying, he's the worst speaker of the five. Clearly, you know, what did I know? Nothing at all. But the interesting thing about what he said was that he made a few mentions of Margaret Thatcher. And there was an air of sort of ritual about it. There were a few boos, but it was panto. But then when things really took off was when he got stuck into Tony Blair. And I've never seen anything like it. The roof came off the theatre, the atmosphere sort of really just suddenly psyched up. It was I knew kind of in theory that this was the undercurrent, but to see that so clearly expressed, the political enemy was the enemy within, was something I'd never really appreciated until that moment. And I think, so I've given a sort of subtitle to this discussion this evening, which I think is, can the Labour Party ever properly talk about Tony Blair without frothing at the mouth? And so we'll come to that later on. We have got some brilliant people to help us understand all this, or just to feed in their points of view. We've got Alan Johnson somewhere on the line. I hope we'll see him now, maybe. Alan Johnson, former Health Secretary, former Education Secretary, former Home Secretary. Grand old man. I hope you won't mind me saying, Alan, of the Labour Party. We've got Anna Turley, former MP for Redcar. Who I think I'm right in saying, Anna, you supported Andy Burnham in the leadership election, but you did serve for a time in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. We've got Darren Jones, who's the Labour MP for Bristol North West. Tip for big things, Darren. And we've got, next to me here in the room, we've got John Rentoul, who chief political commentator at The Independent and author of probably the first political biography of Tony Blair. Was it?
Second.
Okay.
And I've forgotten to turn my phone off. I hate people who do that.
Alan, can I come to you first? The proper title, not my frothing at the mouth title, but the proper title on this evening's conversation is New Labour, Did It Work? Can you kick us off in a sort of generous and open way with a sort of your accounting from 2021 of what worked and what didn't work in that project?
Yes, thank you, Kerry. It's great to join you. I'm more interested in listening to the arguments as to why people think it didn't work. I know that now the theory is Labour's problems began when we won a 179-seat landslide in '97, and it was our 3 victories that started the decline of Labour, which I'd really like to hear some explanation of that. I mean, you have to remember we came through 18 years in opposition. I was in the trade union movement throughout that and only became a Labour candidate 3 weeks before halfway through the '97 general election campaign. And all the way through those 18 years, it wasn't, I mean, Tony, brilliant. And, you know, I bow to no one in that. but kind of a lot of the hard graft had been done by Neil Kinnock and then John Smith, and the party was very different in 97 to how it looked in 79 when we lost power, and that had to happen. Now, given that, you know, we were given this preliminary thought, we were stuck with a label that we had a heart but we didn't have a head, that we just were a tax and spend party with no real understanding of Britain as it approached the 21st century. That's a very important point, because people keep forgetting that, you know, there was huge opposition to a national minimum wage. There was huge opposition to the European Working Time Directive. There was, I'm talking not just about the Conservative Party, most of the newspapers were saying this way lies disaster. Huge opposition to the setting up of DFID, you know, Department for International Development. And so in terms of, did it work? Well, it doesn't matter where you look, of course it worked. When we came into power, people waited 2 years for a simple cataract operation. 1 in 6 patients on the cardiac waiting list died waiting for their heart operation. Our schools, never mind academic attainment, London was a basket case. It wasn't much different around the rest of the country, but kids sat in schools with leaking roofs, that sharing books because there wasn't enough investment. Crime had doubled, and people were really concerned in constituencies like Anna's and mine in Hull. It wasn't a middle class issue, it was a working class issue about crime and antisocial behavior. And, you know, when it came to things like health inequalities, when it came to discrimination in the workplace against people for being gay, being disabled, their ethnicity, I mean, it was rife. It was absolutely rife throughout our society. And, you know, I don't care where you stand, the big puzzle to me was why the trade union movement still looked back on those days as if there was no difference between a Labour government and a Tory government. I mean, I could be here for the rest of the hour if I listed the rights we gave to people at work, not just those that came from the European rights. The right to go on strike and not be sacked, by the way, which had been there since the 19th century, that we got rid of, let alone the right to all the other things, union recognition, the right to be accompanied to discipline and grievance meetings, which don't seem big stuff in the scheme of things. But from where I came from in the trade union movement, this was an enormous step forward and an opportunity for unions to start turning the tide and recruiting.
Yeah.
So yes,
let me jump in there, because I think you've done the easy bit in a way, which was what worked. But there has to be some explanation for what I heard and saw at that rally in Chelmsford. There may have been a very different breed of Labour people than the sort of mainstream that you're talking about. I grant you that was a Jeremy Corbyn rally, but there has to be some explanation for the gap between the kind of litany of success that you're laying out and what I heard in that room in Chelmsford in 2015.
Yeah, well, Kerry, that's what I'm waiting to hear. I'm waiting to hear.
But have you not got a theory? Have you not got
God, listen, you know, I fought the hard left all my political life. They were given an open door and an opportunity to come in and take over the Labour Party, and they took it big time. Of course they were. I mean, you know, if I never mind the Clause 4 debate within the Labour Party, you know, I'm a veteran of the John Smith very modest arrangements to introduce one member, one vote, which apparently now is being defended on the hard left. You know, I remember John Smith getting that through by a whisker. It was this idea that that we existed to be some kind of debating society on the far left, and unless you were offering the socialist transformation of society, then and unless if you were an MP, you were the lowest form of life. If you were general secretary of a trade union, incidentally, that mindset, of course, the gift to them was what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's where it really produced the frothing at the mouth. And there was no sensible debate about that. But I suppose most people coming in would say that's the bit that didn't work, as well as you know, suggesting that we were no better than the Conservative Party in power on domestic issues. I don't know that argument. So
okay, hopefully we'll get some contributions that will help us from a different generation or different political place to understand what didn't work, or what people think didn't work. Immigration, Alan. I was looking back at some polls from 2007 earlier today, and by the time Tony Blair's period as Prime Minister comes to an end, 2007, immigration is right up there as a concern among people. Was that a misstep? Was it a failure of political radar to see the impact that was going to have on, potentially right the way up to Brexit? Who knows? No,
it's a very good point, Kerry. Yeah, because we underestimated. So I was there. I was in the Department of Work and Pensions when the accession countries came in. I had the job of going around to countries like Poland and Hungary pre-accession to make sure, we knew the people there and all that. And you've got to remember, there were 3 countries in Europe, us, Sweden and Republic of Ireland, where the economy was so successful. We had 600,000 vacancies in our economy. And so saying to Poland in particular, look, we're not going to introduce this restriction, you can come in straight away. There was a practical reason for doing that. But we certainly underestimated the figures. David Blunkett will tell you that many of those Polish immigrants were here already because they'd come illegally into the country before we were in power and while we were in power. But that could be said to be a mistake. But you know what? We got nowhere near a net migration figure of 330,000. That particular record is held by David Cameron and Theresa May. And that result came out a month, those ONS statistics, a month before the referendum on the EU. It was a gift to Nigel Farage. We never got anywhere near that. You don't hear that mentioned anywhere. The record for net migration into this country comes from the party that said they would reduce it to the tens of thousands. And they just displayed how difficult it is. And we'll go through that again, I've got no doubt, in a modern economy with people moving around the world in a way that it never happened in the 70s and 80s to keep to that kind of pledge. But yes, that could be said to be a failure, although I think it would have been very strange for us to do anything other in the economic circumstances we were in than to lift that barrier straight away.
Yeah, okay. Anna Turley, can I come to you? Because I just wonder, you had a particular vantage point in Redcar when you were MP there, and you must have come across, there must have been in your constituency quite a number of people who had some degree of disappointment with New Labour for some reason or other. What would, if you were sort of reporting back to us on what those disappointments were, what were they saying to you?
Well, firstly, their frustration with us was very pertinent at the time. It was, I voted Labour all my life, but I can't vote for you with that man as Prime Minister. Let's be absolutely clear about that. That was, for me, in Redcar, 4-1 on the doorstep, Corbyn to Brexit. That was fundamentally the issue. But looking back on the New Labour record, the fascinating thing, obviously, representing the seat that was Mo Molam's seat, and Mo obviously here held in enormous esteem. You can't knock on a door without somebody having a story of how Mo pinched their fags down the club, or she remembered their kids' names and bought them sweets. Absolutely universally loved. But what people said was, we had them all around here. We had Blair, we had Mo Molam, we had Mandelson, we had everyone in the northeast, and they did nothing for us. And that used to just make me kind of choke, because I'd then go on an Alan Johnson-esque rant of, well, hang on, what about Redcar Hospital that you can see from here that didn't exist? What about the Shore Start you've got round the corner? What about your school that's been completely redone? And I'd kind of reel off a whole wealth of New Labour achievements. And so somehow we lost that narrative. Somehow we didn't defend our record. And most importantly, we didn't connect that record with the people that it was most important that we stay connected with in our communities. And Alan was right in his introductory comments when he talked about how so many of our policies were really targeted at those estates, those really deprived, struggling estates where crime was high. You think about the things that we did, New Deal for Communities, millions of pounds going into that, millions of pounds on child poverty, social exclusion, 2 policy areas that I worked on as antisocial behaviour, targeted at those communities that felt crime the most, and were exactly what you'd kind of call I guess, the red wall core estates that we lost in 2019. So my frustration was New Labour never forgot them. And I was very privileged to work for David Blunkett at the Home Office and at the DWP. And he was someone that I will, to my dying day, have the utmost respect for, because every decision he made, every policy that he thought of had those sorts of communities and those sorts of people at the heart of it. When I think about just to jump around onto the immigration point while it's sort of in my mind, Alan's right, that we could perhaps have handled that situation better around the accession countries. But let's not forget, at the time, every day in the paper there were pictures of asylum seekers running through the Channel Tunnel. I was working on the policy to shut the Songat Refugee Centre in Calais and to do the juxtaposed controls, which was about trying to work in partnership with France and stem flows of illegal migration. So this was the kind of crisis at the time. And actually, managed migration across the EU was not seen as the big challenge. We were dealing with the sort of crisis that we're seeing now. And because, again, David had that kind of antennae that core seats like Redcar and Sheffield Brightside, were angry about sort of illegal immigration and so on. So I think my frustration is that we worked really hard for communities like this, like mine. We delivered for communities like mine, but we weren't proud enough of our record. If I was going to challenge us and say where we fell short, there are areas. I mean, I'd say particularly, although we had things like New Deal for communities and New Deal on unemployment and so on, I think there were structural issues in the economy in post-industrial areas like Redcar, where we had seen decline of steelworking, decline of shipping and ports and so on, decline of the chemical industry, and we hadn't had a proper transition for some of those areas. And I think Gordon was starting to do some of that sort of big thinking and the kickstart stuff towards the end, as the crash was coming. But I would say that we didn't have enough of a kind of structural fix in the economy to deal with that. We can all talk about housing and things that we didn't tackle in housing, and I'd also say there were probably issues with the Labour Party that I wish we'd sort of resolved or made more sustainable. And perhaps there were some of us that were complacent because we'd come through that generation. We hadn't known the battles like Alan has fought, and we weren't ready. And I thought those battles had been fought and won by the likes of Alan and Neil Kinnock and others, and that we wouldn't again see that party sort of taken over to that extent. So I think there were some things that we could have learned to perhaps put in place more sustainably and create a sort of resilience to New Labour that I'd have liked to have seen. But overall, like Alan, I still struggle to understand why people can say that New Labour did nothing for us, because the evidence is here before my eyes in one of the most deprived parts of the country.
And if I on the question of inequality, so I think the sort of overall record, if you take the sort of 1997-2010 record, was that over that time inequality rose slightly, but probably would have risen a great deal more had it not been for all the redistributive measures, the tax credits and all that kind of stuff. But probably the impression people had of New Labour was that it was blasé about inequality in a way that I think people like you would say wasn't true. Is that a failure of messaging, or was there a policy miss on inequality to some extent as well, do you think?
Perhaps a bit of both. I mean, I would definitely say a failure on messaging. I think when people talk about a growth in inequality in that time, I think that when you look at the kind of graphs and the facts, those at the very, very top did extremely well. Those at the bottom are sort of a 2%. Just weren't lifted out. So I mean, you look at the sort of bottom third of people in terms of income and so on, had a huge lift and were far more disproportionately benefited than those at the higher income scales because of things like tax credits and a lot of investment that went in. So we lifted working people and the sort of bottom third in terms of income out of poverty, particularly say targeted at pensioners and children. But the work that I was doing at the end of Tony's sort of era with Hilary Armstrong in the Cabinet Office was about social exclusion and trying to reach those families who just hadn't benefited from the kind of lifting of a lot of the boats in working class communities. Why was that? Why was the system failing them? Why were they not benefiting from a lot of the measures that had been put in place? What were the challenges that we still faced around, structural problems in local economies, around issues of unemployment, housing, inequalities, around issues like drug and alcohol dependency, all these sorts of homelessness, all of these sorts of issues we were targeting on the most excluded. But I think it's safe if you took the sort of poorest and the very, very sort of top 2% out, actually inequality was hugely lowered under New Labour. So actually I think our record on that is one of success. I think perhaps people like to portray the sort of new Labour era, perhaps because of misquoting Peter Mandelson about being relaxed about the extremely wealthy, forgetting the second half of that said as long as they pay their taxes. And I think people, have created that perception. And I think you're always at a balance in Labour, I think, between we all know that we care the most, about people who are left behind, who've been let down by society, who, are struggling to have the opportunities because of where they live and the postcode that they grew up in. But we also can only win elections when we represent the whole of the country. And New Labour was very, very pertinent to that. So I think it's easy to say when you're trying to appeal to a broader mass of the population, you're trying to talk about aspiration, about opportunity, about success, and actually welcoming and encouraging people getting on and getting by and doing well and having a good holiday and so on. It's very easy to think that you don't care about those at the bottom. And I think that's a very unfair accusation to make at a government that had a target to eradicate child poverty. I mean, that seems unimaginable now. Can you imagine this government talking about eradicating child poverty, that had an entire department set up for social exclusion, that eradicated rough sleeping? These are phenomenal achievements, but that people very rarely credit New Labour for.
Okay. I'm told, sorry, I'm struggling with this I've got an iPad which I don't know how to use really, that's the problem I'm encountering. But I'm told that Adrian Renton has got his hand up. Adrian, are you out there and trying to jump in? Because I'd love to hear from you if you are.
Mute myself. I need to unmute myself.
You're unmuted.
I'm very grateful for this meeting, and can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just want to reflect upon my early take upon what was said by the first speaker. The first speaker kicked off by saying we got to Jeremy Corbyn at some stage as number 5 in a speaking list, and he was the worst speaker, and I understand that. And but there is a problem in how we understand who the people are who can perform in this. The second issue that was raised was the decline of New Labour after 3 successive election victories. And the point that I want to make is a very simple one. If you want to understand what went wrong with New Labour, you have to understand the complicity which New Labour developed with the media structures within which we're operating, which is, of course, what taught us media and its setup was all about. There was a complicity with that, and there was a desire on the part of Labour to think that the only thing that they could do was manage the political system as it existed. And the political system as it exists emerges from a long period of dysfunction, inequality, and many other things. So I just want to say that we need to take a longer view on this. We need to understand the relation with the media in particular, because we've run through this the last years and seen what's happened politically, and we're just taking on board the fact that things are very different now. We need to focus on 2 things as Labour, the Labour Party, New Labour, the left, people that are actually concerned about the ecosystem, people that are concerned about the relationships between different classes and different societies, all of those things. We need to focus on rebuilding the political system as something that is fit for purpose, and that means the democratic process. And we need to understand how we're going to rebuild the way that things are done through business or whatever, in a way which allows us to make it sustainable for everything. So I'm grateful to you for your time. That's my take. If I go back to Tony, we sold out to the media.
Adrian, I'm grateful to you.
Never to do that. Thank you for your time.
No, thank you very much. I want to come in a second to Nathan Newport Gay, who's been saying some interesting things in the chat as well. But before I do that, and John in the room, Darren, are you out there? Darren Jones.
Hello.
Hey, thanks for joining us. I'm actually interested in how this whole thing feels to you, because I think you're 34. So if my maths is right, you must have been about 20 when Tony Blair left office. And I wonder whether this either seems like a an irrelevance to you as a sort of Labour MP in Bristol now, or whether you're sitting there thinking, I can see the whole rest of my life mapped out in this way, and we're just going to go around in circles.
Well, look, I say with respect and sadness that it's a history lesson. And I'm a bit bored in the Labour Party of going around in circles trying to decide who over the past God knows how many generations was better than each other. I'm a Labour MP because I want Labour to be in government, because I want to improve our country for the future. Now, I'm not a Luddite, so history is important, and I'm always grateful to, Tony, Gordon, Peter, lots of people from that era who generously offer me their time and their mentorship. But I have to say, it gets a bit tedious when we spend our whole time having this discussion as opposed to talking about the country. I'm really interested, I'm really excited about our country. And I think one of the things that I would observe from the historical perspective about New Labour, which I think we need to remember today, is that it's very easy for the Labour Party, I think, to moan about the things that are bad in our country. And there are lots of things that we need to improve for people and for our country and its role in the world. But I would quite like us to remember there are lots of good things that we should be excited about. And we can't actually fix the bad things unless we leverage the good things. And I think some energy can come about from identifying our strengths and knowing that we are one of the wealthiest, most innovative countries in the world, and that many of the problems that we talk about, which do need to be fixed, can be fixed. We just need a Labour government to do that. And I think that we could kind of move away from this kind of going round in circles about whether words in a pamphlet mean you're more Blairite or more Smithian or more whatever, and actually start talking about the future of our country. I think it'd be better for everybody, and I'd be much more interested.
Okay, well, we're not going to do that for the next half hour, I'm afraid. Let me make a case for why I think it might still be important to have this conversation, which is that I wonder what you think it does to a party if it's driven to become sort of ahistoric, that it can't talk about its past because it's just too difficult to go there. So John, who's with me, has read the entire Keir Starmer Fabian pamphlet. I haven't read all of it. But I did a word search. It mentions in 14,000 words, mentions Blair twice, doesn't actually say the name Tony at all, doesn't mention Jeremy Corbyn at all, and mentions Joe Strummer once. And so I wonder if you think there is a problem that you get into as a party if you can't make a sensible judgment on either the recent past or the past slightly further away, because most other parties do seem able to do that.
And as I say, history is important, not least because we need to look to our history to know how to win an election, because we haven't won one for so long. We need to look to our history to know what it means to be effective at persuading people who vote Conservative, to vote for the Labour Party. We need to look to our history to remember that we have, or should have, the energy and the confidence to get out there and to win elections. And I fear that we've lost our confidence over the many years that we've now been in opposition. So it is really important. And that's why, my point to one side, I'm always keen to listen to those people who did it, who made it, who got across the line and secured a Labour government and changed the country for the better, because I'm not interested in that as a member of Parliament. I'm interested because I benefited from it. I mean, you mentioned that I was in my 20s when Tony left office. I was 11 when he came into office in 1997. And I experienced the benefit of a national minimum wage, of investments in our schools. My secondary school was one of the worst performing in the country. Only 5 of us ended up going to university. It's now much better as an academy school. The hospital I was born in my now constituency, was a post-World War hospital with leaky roofs. It's now one of Europe's best performing hospitals with a brand new building built by the Labour government. So I've experienced the success of New Labour in government over multiple terms, which I think is really important when we think about the big issues that we're trying to tackle as a country. And we should have that historical debate, but only as a basis for better informing, better evidencing, and fueling our energy and our passion for winning the next election.
Okay. Let me just say, if you're in the room, I would love to hear from you. We've got microphones, we'll pass them around. It's great to mix people in the room and people on Zoom, so please do chip in if you've got something to say. That would be great. Nathan, in the meantime, Nathan Newport Gay, are you out there on Zoom?
Yeah.
Can I just, thanks for joining in. You had a couple of reasons that you put into the chat why you thought New Labour might not have lasted as a project. What was on your mind?
Well, the first one's devolution, something that I noticed has conveniently been skirted around, because I think it is the sorest of points when it comes to the New Labour project, aside from Iraq and Afghanistan. Because set up in the wake of the victory in 1997, there was quite clearly a view from some very senior figures in New Labour, like Donald Dewar, that it was Labour's project in setting up devolution, and Labour would thus be rewarded by staying in power. But that then also led to this belief that there didn't need to be any kind of forward thinking that says what happens when we get to the point in time when there isn't a Labour government in Holyrood or in Cardiff Bay, and what intergovernmental structures do we then need? Because the ministers' councils that we had clearly have very little impact in resolving tensions and disputes. And yes, the SNP as a project is designed to be adversarial to Westminster, but even that could have been lessened in its nature if there'd been more to be done with the intergovernmental structures, which I think is something, looking back, you can see quite evidently that even people like Gordon Brown would admit that was a mistake in the process of creation. And then the other bit that I think really does a lot more harm to the lasting ability of the New Labour project is the slight perceived arrogance in some ways about it. I know from knocking on doors that whenever you bring it up, a fair few people do present this idea that people like Tony Blair and other people within the Labour Party came across, particularly towards the end, as quite arrogant, is that what they were doing was right because they said so and not because they justified it, like the decision about immigration and the admission of the Eastern European countries into the European Union. That could have been easily diffused as an issue if Labour hadn't just been like, oh, well, we've done it for an economic reason, but we've never really told anybody. And the white paper on immigration, which came out and suggested there should be a more forceful argument about the pros of immigration, it was mentioned a couple of times and it went away again. And I think that kind of belief that somehow they would be right really did much more harm to it than it could have, because it was almost like they chose not to defend what they had created. And I think that then fed back into this attitude much later on, which has been added to in a lot of ways incorrectly by those who want to bring down what New Labour did, that it was this out of touch sort of project, despite the fact that it brought in a lot of things that actually a lot of people wanted and did a lot of good. And if it wasn't for Iraq and Afghanistan, it would be remembered as a great social reforming government.
That's great. That was really helpful. I can see, actually, Nathan, thank you so much. I can see John nodding at points with what you were saying. John, can I just come to you as a sort of student of Tony Blair, I suppose, because I'm interested in how much you think he was obviously absolutely central to the early success of the New Labour project. His popularity in those early days was something we'd never seen before in this country, and he sustained it for some time as Prime Minister. How central was he to the problems that New Labour ran into, do you think?
Well, as you say, Corbynism was entirely powered by a reaction in the Labour Party against Tony Blair and everything he stood for. And I think that's something that is very difficult for him and Blairites like me to come to terms with. I mean, it just took us completely by surprise. I mean, it was one of the worst political mistakes I made as a journalist, was to think that there was absolutely no chance of a serious political party electing someone like Jeremy Corbyn as leader. And when it dawned on me, it was a profound shock, and it did require sort of reassessing everything that happened. I mean, as to the...
But I was thinking really about the sort of character of Tony Blair. Was that Nathan mentioned the sort of the sense of distance and the sense of difference, I suppose, that some people thought he projected.
Yeah, that's because people have short memories. I mean, they loved him, and then then they stopped loving him. I mean, I think that is part of the problem about politics, is people have short memories, and I think you know, I mean, a lot of Anna Turley's constituents have short memories about the benefits of a new Labour government, and then the Labour Party had extremely short memories about what it took to win elections. And I think, you know, one of the causes of the reaction was the failure of the Labour Party to renew itself in government, which was caused by Alan Johnson failing to be Tony Blair's successor as Prime Minister. I think if Alan Johnson had been Prime Minister, Labour would probably still be in government.
We'll come to that in a second, perhaps. But we've skirted round. I mean, people have touched on Iraq. It's come up, but in the end, probably for Tony Blair, that's the thing, isn't it?
Well, in the Labour Party, yes. I mean, I don't think among the population as a whole it's that important. But I mean, I certainly think, you know, among people who regard themselves as left wing, yeah, it was an absolute disaster, and I think that does explain what a lot of the driving force behind the reaction against him was. Because I mean, you know, you've got to go back from 2015. I mean, it's not just the arrival of Jeremy Corbyn. It was the reason Tony Blair couldn't survive as Prime Minister beyond 2007, which he should have done in any other rational world. He would have done, but the Labour Party had enough of him. And I think Iraq was a very large part of that.
Yeah. Alan Johnson, can I come back to you on Iraq? Because you mentioned it in Afghanistan. But in your columns of, you know, your long column of successes and your, you know, in your almost non-existent column of failures, where do you, how do you think of Iraq now?
Don't forget, it was the first time we ever went to war by anything other than royal proclamation. We had a debate in Parliament, a meaningful debate in Parliament. And if given the same circumstances, I'd have voted the same way now as I did then. And there is a big issue about what would have happened had Saddam and his crazy sons still been in power there. But undoubtedly that affected Tony, although we won an election, not just won it with a handsome majority, perhaps not the landslides of 97 and 2001, but a very substantial majority after Iraq. Now, the interesting point I thought there was about the switch from Tony to Gordon. I mean, the TBGBs certainly didn't help us in power. But what you have to remember is Tony knew he had a sell-by date. He was going to go. He was forced out just a little earlier than he would have liked to. But he knew that he would be handing over. Gordon was the natural successor, despite John's great campaign, which I still got my AJ for PM badge, John. Thank you for that. Gordon was the natural successor, and Gordon was very popular because it was Lennon-McCartney, wasn't it? He, you know, if Tony was McCartney, Brown was Lennon, and the public liked this unruffled, this unplugged look of Gordon, you know, with the attack on Glasgow airport and the way he dealt with that, the flooding. I mean, we were 18 points ahead in the polls. Gordon's, and you know, this has to be seen in the, I know people will write a great thesis on this, but being close up there, Gordon's big selling point was his integrity. And when he couldn't make up his mind whether to have an election or not, and then by the time he had decided not to have one, which I think was the right decision, we had dropped in the polls and the Tories had had a conference and had suddenly, overnight, that reputation for integrity went. That hadn't have happened. There is every chance that Gordon's time as Tony's natural successor, leave out all the kind of, you know, playground fighting over here, he was the natural successor, could have gone more successfully. And then in 2010, we might have, you know, it was a hung parliament, for Christ's sake. I mean, we lost, certainly, but nobody won. It was a hung parliament. There was the chance that history being rewritten just on one decision or one indecision by Gordon in the early days of his premiership.
Okay, I've got a couple of tentative hands going up in the room. And I do want to come to Tom Levitt, who's been very active in the chat as well. So while we're just getting microphones here, Tom, are you free and ready?
Yes, I am.
And sorry, I've been scrolling down through the chat. Did you say you were a Labour MP?
I was indeed, yes. I came at the same time as Alan, and I left in 2010.
Okay. And if I asked you to do the same sort of accounting of New Labour that I asked Alan to do at the beginning, where would you net out on that?
I'm afraid, from a controversial point of view, I probably agree with Alan on almost everything. But one issue which hasn't been mentioned is that of Sure Start. I think Sure Start, in many ways, was the big project of the Labour years. It was an investment in low income and communities where people felt very much not engaged. It was an investment in children. It was a massive per head investment in the least fortunate children with the worst prospects in the country. The problem with Sure Start was you wouldn't know whether it had worked or not for another 15 or 20 years. But you could see that it was doing so much good because the first thing the Tories did when they came in 2010 was to start to dismantle it. And you know, it was because it was doing so much and potentially doing so much more for those people who traditionally are at the core of where Labour's heart is and Labour's activities are, that it aroused their ire, and it became the silent killer, if you like, of the Sure Start project. It was almost completely dismantled. And I think that, to add to the list that Anna gave as well, was in many ways the defining issue of that time, and the one which we will regret its going, perhaps more than some of the others.
I think a lot of people would have Sure Start on their list of really significant successes, wouldn't they? So I think, probably, we're with you on that. But let me just come to a couple of people in the room. We come to you, so if you just say your name and then in you come.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Friso, and basically my thinking on all of this is that it's a bit more about sort of like the vibe of politics rather than specifically the policies, which as sort of mainly MPs, we're mainly focused on. Because I'm a bit too young to remember life before Tony Blair, but throughout the entirety of the New Labour project and then throughout the coalition years, the vibe of politics was always very similar. It was all pretty slick, and the arguments were being had over what seemed like minor disagreements. And so the disagreement about whether New Labour was a good thing came mainly from within the Labour Party, which seemed mainly to be a disagreement with the coalition government rather than maybe actually New Labour's tenure in power. And it could be that it's sort of just anger at the political sort of slickness rather than particularly New Labour.
Okay, and if that was the vibe, then what does that do to you? What does that do to your engagement or your voting intentions or whatever?
You vote for someone who's not with that vibe. You vote for someone who shows up in a baggy, mothballed jumper like Jeremy Corbyn, who says that we've got to do something radically different, right? And that's where a lot of the anger against New Labour came from, was from that part of the Labour Party.
Putting you on the spot, is that what you did? The mothballs and the baggy jumper, or
no, I voted Lib Dem, so I don't know where that is.
Like, do quite a good line in baggy jumpers and mothballs as well, I think. But, okay, thank you. And you, if you can say your name as well, that would be great.
Yeah, my name's Nick Royal. I think that New Labour basically dealt with the electorate as it is, rather than how they want it to be. Because the people who vote Labour in Anna's constituency or in Alan's constituency aren't the kind of people perhaps that Labour MPs are comfortable with, because they are a bit Brexity before Brexit. They are patriotic, they are like immigrant friends, but are uncomfortable with immigration. And actually that New Labour kind of understood that electorate a lot more easily than the Labour Party has done over the last 5 years. I think that's a crucial point about New Labour, is that they understood the people who were voting for it, and it's no coincidence that people like Alan Johnson or David Blunkett, who've both been mentioned, were Home Secretaries, and they are quite right wing in a Labour setting in terms of ASBOs and what have you. And the ASBOs, I come from a constituency up north, Warrington, and you could see how popular that is amongst working class people, because there was low level crime that couldn't be dealt with. The ASBOs caused conniptions in the Parliamentary Labour Party, but was loved by the electorate.
And so you were growing up in Warrington, and you could see ASBOs being put in place around you?
Yeah, you could see it. So I lived in quite
Actually, do me a favour, because there may be people who can't remember what an ASBO was.
So it's an antisocial behavioural order, and basically what it was it was a kind of a 3-strike or you're out rule on antisocial behaviour. So the kind of stuff that wasn't dealt with by the police because it was too low level, but was causing misery to people on housing estates. The introduction of ASBOs meant that the police had the powers after 3 strikes to basically chuck them in jail, and it was hugely a liberal for the, as I said, for the Parliamentary Labour Party, but the electorate and that New Labour electorate loved it. I think New Labour listened to that electorate then, and they don't now.
Yeah. Anna Turley, I'll come to you in a second, sir. Anna, let me just come back to you, if I may. I'm intrigued to know whether you think it's possible to draw a line between some of the big things that have happened since the New Labour era, something particularly of Brexit and the sort of shift in the red wall seats, and the way that New Labour went about its business. Is that kind of causal thing possible, or is there just too much mess in the way to say, the financial crisis and everything else that gets in the way of any kind of read across from what New Labour did to those huge developments that happened not that long after those governments were not elected anymore?
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's one that I always remain really optimistic about, because people forget that Redcar, as a red wall seat, as it were, actually fell in 2010. It fell with a 22% swing to the Liberal Democrats, and that wasn't Iraq. That was because the steelworks was mothballed here for the first time, and the Lib Dems very, very cleverly, as we know they do, particularly at local level, ran the narrative. New Labour's forgotten about you. Your MP, lives and works down in London. They're out of touch. New Labour's had its day. You want a good kind of local industry man to stand up for you, and that was incredibly powerful. So that killing of New Labour, particularly after the crash in 2008, was an absolute hand blow here in Redcar in 2010. But we built it back, and we worked really, really hard at grassroots level to rebuild that trust, to connect with people on the issues that really matter to them, to present a local Labour Party in particular that was listening, that was engaging with people, that was on their side, to the extent that we won the seat back in 2015, and the Steelworks was then finally nailed in the coffin by the Tories in 2015, and we were, on people's side, rallying at the beaches, campaigning in Parliament, and making sure that people could see that Labour was on people's side and was standing up for the history, the heritage of this fabulous steelworking area that built the world. And the tragedy is then that Corbyn and Brexit came and just put an absolute line through that, and put a divide through the community with myself and others who represented Labour, but particularly people like me who were very, very concerned about the implications of Brexit on a manufacturing area like Teesside, and the community who the previous speaker was very articulate and eloquent about, people who are patriotic, not necessarily nationalistic, but patriotic, proud of their country. And suddenly we were on the other side of that divide. And that was really, really difficult to be, having kind of been fighting on behalf of your community and speaking with one voice on their behalf, to suddenly feel that you were separated from them. And the Tories were driving that seam to say, they don't understand you, they're out of touch, they don't believe in your country, and to have Jeremy Corbyn as the symbol of all of that was incredibly powerful. And that's how we saw, not just in Redcar, but in cities where, people were pro-Brexit, we lost as well. So it was, I don't need to tell people how disastrous it was, but I believe, because of my experience between sort of 2012 and 2015, it can be turned around. It needs to be done at the top, and I think here is making big progress, and the stuff today is the steps that we start to need to see to set out a vision. But I would love to see the sort of politics that we've been talking about, the sort of you need a brain. I was saying politics, it's like the Wizard of Oz kind of scarecrow and Tin Man, and you need a brain, you need a heart, and you need guts, courage, and we've got to have all of those to reconnect with people in constituencies like Redcar, so that they think we're speaking on their behalf. And actually, sorry, just to go back to the points Darren made at the beginning, he's absolutely right about the positivity. One of the reasons why the Tories did so well here, particularly with the Mayor Ben Hatcham that they've got here, was because they were positive. They were relentlessly positive about the area, about its potential, about the country, about the future. And that's what we've got to have a vision for the country that's positive and inspiring and says that we believe in the country or in areas like Teesside. And unfortunately, we just haven't been there in recent years. And that's something that's a lesson that we've got to learn from New Labour to put into the future.
Great, Anna, thank you. I'm just going to come to someone in the room who's been waiting to come in, and just say your name if you would.
My name is Jack, but the kernel of my point is pretty redundant now, because I was just going to say that one phrase that had been completely neglected was the financial crisis. And whether or not the indignation that was seen in Redcar, whether or not that there was a temporal shift after the financial crisis, that maybe when you said maybe before the financial crisis, they said, oh, there's a new hospital, lovely, lovely. But then the financial crisis hit and all of that was forgotten. And then all of the association was New Labour hand in glove with bankers, New Labour tarnished on that front, and it had completely lost that. And especially maybe was that, I don't know, because I'm very young, was that when the immigration came in? Was the financial crisis when all of a sudden the indignation towards New Labour with immigration came in? So was that? I mean, you've kind of.
You're not allowed to ask questions, but you're absolutely right. That was when. I mean, previously immigration had been tolerated, but I think the financial crash led to it being resented, and it became much more of a difficult issue for Labour.
Yeah, I think that's fair, isn't it? Let me come back to Darren. Are you? I know you nipped away for a second, Darren. But are you back with us?
I am. Hello.
Childcare and Zoom calls.
Yeah.
That's life, isn't it? I'm interested in what you think we should do with New Labour now. So there's one option would be to say, right, there's a playbook there that Labour should go and hire the new Philip Gould and do the best set of polling that's ever been done and build some policies out of that and so on and so forth. There's a template there that you might find useful. Do you bin New Labour because it's too problematic a concept to be useful these days? What are you going to do with this thing, Darren?
What am I going to do with it? I mean, I think we need to internalize it. And what I mean by that is learn the lessons, but recognize that we can't just go back to it. Our route to power isn't the same route in 1997, in my view, because of demographic changes and the change in where people have moved to live and how higher education has affected people in different areas and how they vote and so on and so forth. I think the one thing, if you listen to Tony Blair talk about New Labour, that is the thing that we need to hold on to, which is understanding the country as it is now and what the British people want from the country. And I don't think the Labour Party has been in that place for some time. And also being open to getting out there and talking to people who you might not normally talk to. I mean, I'm convinced there are parliamentary constituencies that are Tory right now, maybe have been Liberal Democrat in the past, they can be Labour in the future. But I don't think we have the resources there, the people there. I don't think we're sending MPs there. I don't think we're necessarily trying to talk to those voters. And on the one hand, I understand the difficulty in the Labour Party. We were created to be the voice of working people in Parliament. And I'm not for 1 second saying ignore the red wall and go off into kind of Surrey. But what I am saying is don't rule out Surrey, because actually we should be going to talk to those people, because as New Labour showed, we can govern for the whole country. But for too long now, we have this kind of anxiety about even being open to the idea that we should go out there and try to talk to those people and understand what they want from the country and how Labour can provide the answer. And the issue is that, and this is another New Labour lesson, the Conservatives win by default in our country. The task on us is so much harder to get out there and persuade people for us in order to be able to form a majority. And if we just focus on particular seats or an outdated route to power based on 97, it's just not going to work. And that's why we've been failing for so many years now.
And do you think, Darren, that you obviously do think that there is an appetite for that sort of set of policies that does straddle, Sevenoaks and Stockton-on-Tees? Because I guess if you look at the way the electoral map has shifted and the way that people's decision-making has shifted in politics, which is arguably more about culture and identity now than it was about old adherences and that, it feels as if something fundamental has moved. And I guess for some people, that calls into question whether at least the New Labour Blairite approach, which was that you could find policies that would appeal in both places, whether that can still run.
Economics trumps cultural. The trouble is we've been fighting in the cultural
It didn't
kind
in
of
Brexit,
ring.
did it, Darren?
Well, maybe for the first time, but in that post-Brexit world,
that's the world we're in.
No, but we're now in the post-Brexit world. And now, look, I was an avid Remainer. I broke the whip in voting for the Brexit deal because I didn't want to be associated with it. And I speak quite frankly about the fact that it was a folly and we should never have even suggested, I think, in the Labour Party that we supported it. But that's because the economics of it. I think if you talk to anybody, whether they're in Sevenoaks or, Anna might correct me, but I'm sure in Redcar or here in Bristol Northwest, what people want is the opportunity to have meaningful, well-paid work that allows them to pay their bills. They want a house they can afford to live in. They want good schools for their children. They want to know that the NHS is protected and invested in and modernized in order to meet their needs and their families' needs for the future. These are economic issues. And I suppose the challenge for the Labour Party, the challenge for our country, and the Tories are struggling with this too, is what does the modern state look like in the constraints of our economic growth in the UK? Tony and Gordon and Alan and others were in a fortunate position with a growing economy, riding the tide of globalization, being able to bring in private sector finance to help deliver on public sector priorities, which crashed, as one of your members in the audience said, in 2008. And ever since then, the Labour Party hasn't been able to answer how we're going to pay for things. Now, the Tories get away with saying, we're going to not raise taxes, and then they raise taxes. They're going to say, oh, Labour always increases the debt, when actually the debt is the highest it has been forever under the Tories, year on year, since they've been in government. And I just think we need to be in that fight about economic policy, about what that means for people, and not get too distracted by all of these kind of cultural debates. And as I said at the very beginning of this, what is probably now a rant, and for which I apologize, is going out there and recognizing that I think there is more in that brings people together across very many constituencies in the country, and be confident and bold about that.
I'm just going to come to James, my colleague James is in the room here, and then I'm going to come back to you, Alan, if I may.
So I'm just really interested, Kerry, in what Darren said now, and I'd be really interested to know what John thinks of it too, because what I don't understand is, and the reason really for having this conversation about whether New Labour worked is obviously as a critique of Labour today as it goes into this conference. New Labour clearly worked unarguably in one sense. It worked politically. It won 3 general elections. What I don't understand is when I hear Darren there, when he says, look, the Conservatives are raising taxes. The Conservatives have jacked up debt. What do you do if you're Labour? Are you for that or are you against it? And I don't know what the Blairite prescription would be, because it seems to me that if you want to be Blairite politically, you have to sell Surrey on the prospect of a certain degree of fiscal prudence. But if you want to be Blairite structurally, if you want to change the country, you have to have a tolerance for a high level of debt and taxation. And that seems to me to be the question that is not answered by Keir Starmer, but it's also not necessarily answered by the Blairites today either.
Okay, Alan, can I just pick up directly, Alan Johnson, with you on that question? It's not, it's clearly not too late to be Prime Minister. So let's make you Prime Minister. Let's make you Prime Minister now. What kind, on that set of questions that James raised, what kind of Labour Party could you envisage now that does manage to answer the fears of Surrey and address the hopes of Stockton-on-Tees?
It's a very good question. And, these are different times now. But what you have to remember, and in a sense, is ducking that question. But but the whole base of this is why New Labour, and what Keir Starmer has to do is show we're not Corbyn's Labour Party. Now, it was easier for us to do because there was a long period of years between, militant and then winning power. There's not that long a period now, but people have to be reassured that before you get onto the policy stuff, before you can convince them that actually there has to be a way to pay for social care and raising national insurance. It's an unfair way, but I think probably we're going to have to swallow that, because we can't kind of reinvent the wheel. But before you get the chance to be listened to, you have to convince people, particularly the red wall seats, that you've changed. Part of that, incidentally, and part of the thing, Anna will know this, why people were working class people in particular, why we lost Bishop Auckland, Bolsover, Grimsby, Scunthorpe, is because for the Corbynites, and that means for many people Labour, because it's their only experience of Labour, the working class didn't consist of individuals. They didn't have agency. They didn't have they were just a lump. They were the lumpen proletariat. I mean, that is seriously the way they were addressed and the way they felt.
Yeah, but I guess at the heart of the question, there's this really interesting thing: is what do you do if you're up against a high-spending Conservative government? Do you, as Labour, just say, "All right, we'll spend more," or what are you going to do with that? Because it does look as if competence on its own might not be enough to win through. So on that spending question, how should Labour be thinking about that?
I think it might, but I think we have to, end the kind of idea that you just spend more. I think the competence thing isn't something to be passed over. The competence thing is a major attack on this government. And incidentally, Keir is in the perfect position. He was the director of public prosecutions, for Christ's sake, to bring the argument back to the points Anna was making about crime and others were making, crime and antisocial behaviour. And if there's any, I haven't read the Fabian pamphlet either, but there is an issue about decency and trustworthiness. Working class people in particular. We're not just trying to win working class votes. We want middle class votes and every class of vote. But we're talking about red wall seats here, and they're largely working class areas. They don't like a prime minister who turns up with his hair all over the place and seems to be able to get away, that immorality kind of point of it. So you have to work at that, and you have to show there is an alternative, and that the person waiting to take over, that they think could be imagined on the steps of 10 Downing Street. This is Keir's greatest strength. He's done if you've been director of public prosecutions and you don't finish and go off to the Lords, which most of them did, and you're there saying, look, I'm someone who's done a proper job, you can close your eyes and think of Keir Starmer being on the doorstep of number 10. Don't underestimate that. That's a really important attribute for him.
Okay, Alan, I'm going to wrap up with you, John, if I may. Just, we are running out of time very quickly. What's your thought on that sort of positioning question of how Labour should respond to this particular Conservative government now?
Well, that's very simple, because the Blairite verities are always true. If you remember what Labour did in '97, they accepted the Conservative spending plans for the next 2 years after the general election. So what you do is you accept exactly the same overall level of spending and taxation, but you reprioritise within that. And they had the windfall tax on the utilities, which was a bauble, but it signified values. And I think that's, it was interesting that Alan Johnson instinctively didn't want to say that Labour should go into an election promising to raise taxes. And I think that's absolutely right. And that will always be true, except in 2017 when it wasn't.
Okay, we are indeed, I think we're out of time, aren't we? A little bit over.
If I can just advertise my book.
There's going to be a bit of book advertising. So there's, hold it up, John, go and show us around. Tell us about it.
Heroes or Villains. This was because we felt, John Davis and I, that the Blair government just hadn't been treated as a government objectively. It was just treated as a whipping boy. So we wanted to set out the record. And I think actually, since we wrote it, I think public opinion has moved back to accepting that some good things at least happened during those 10 years. And if I could just also advertise, there's a documentary on the BBC on the 4th of October, starting 5-part documentary.
Looking forward to that, yeah.
Blair and Brown, the New Labour Revolution.
Alan, I can't let you go without advertising your book, because it wouldn't be fair to let John do his. You've written a book, a fiction, a novel, haven't you, John, Alan?
Yeah, trouble is I haven't got a copy here with me on my desk. I can recommend John's book because I reviewed it. It's terrific. I reviewed it for The Spectator. My book is Late Train to Gypsy Hill. It's a thriller, it's a mystery, it's a love story, and it's all about Russian poisoning. So very much in the news. You'll love it.
All right. Well, I gave my mum and dad originally the first book he wrote, and they went out and bought the next three. So, they do go well, these things. Alan, thank you ever so much. John, thank you. Darren and Anna, thank you very much. Everybody here, everybody on Zoom, thank you. I think we ended actually in a really interesting place, which is to, I think, try and figure out what all that means for here and now, which is the real point. I'm not sure we got even close to a real answer to whether the lessons of New Labour, how they translate to the current position with a Tory government that is determined to spend in the way that it is. Actually, I think in fairness to it, was determined to spend in those constituencies before the pandemic. So something really profound has shifted there. And I don't think yet that Labour has quite all the answers to how it deals with that basket of spending questions, of cultural questions, of questions of identity. So maybe we'll run one of these again to look at that, all those aspects of things. For this evening, I think the sort of balance sheet of New Labour, huge successes on Sure Start, on child poverty, on pensioner poverty, on public services, on infrastructure. The country looked. Don't forget Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, yeah. All right, well, no, let's not start this all again. Anyway, but a tremendous range of successes there. I think immigration has always interested me as a sort of question of political radar. Inequality a little bit, I think, in the same way. And I think Iraq is another one that is going to be unresolved probably for the rest of my lifetime. But thank you all very much for coming. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll hope to see you again very soon. When have we got Ed Balls? I've forgotten. Wednesday, Ed Balls. Okay, join us for that too. Okay, thank you all. Cheers.